You found the Backup Wrap Up, your go to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In our final episode about DR testing, the rubber meets the road. Last time we talked about getting ready for your DR test. And this time we're talking about actually running the test. We'll cover what you need to do during the test, like coordinating between teams, documenting what goes wrong, because something always goes wrong, and making sure that you've got backup communication methods ready. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of that really important production database that we had just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And if you could just take a couple of seconds to either like or subscribe or follow the channel so that you can always get our great content, that would be awesome. I am once again joined by a guy who has finally put some of his car knowledge to use. Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm doing well, Curtis. And yes, I am finally putting some of that car knowledge to use. For viewers who may not, or listeners who may not be aware, I tend to watch a lot of car YouTube stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of it tends to be around fabrication, engine rebuilding, drag racing. It's a really odd mix. But a lot of it is just YouTube knowledge, and so I finally decided to try something different, and I've been taking auto shop classes at my local community college, which has been amazing. And so as part of it, you actually have a hands-on lab section where you get to actually work on cars, like your own car. And right now it's all basic stuff, right? So oil changes, underhood inspections, inspecting cooling systems. But we actually got things like charging tests, compression tests, leak down tests, replacing spark plugs. So I'm excited. I'm actually using these hands for things.
And you did an oil change yesterday on your wife's car.
I did do an oil change on my wife's car. Yep.
How filthy was the oil in your wife's car?
Yeah, it looked almost brand new. It didn't have many miles since the last oil change. I'd probably say 500 or 600 miles. But it was a sacrifice since I needed to actually do an oil change for the class. So
Right. Now, this isn't the first time you've done an oil change, right?
no,
Okay.
I've done one in the past. But this is the first time I've done it on a lift, which, oh my God, is so much nicer.
Oh, you brought her car into the
Yeah,
class.
into the class, and we put it
Oh,
on a
I see,
two-post
I see.
lift. And
Yeah, everything's nicer on a lift,
oh
absolutely.
yeah, when you're not like struggling underneath the car, trying not to drop the hot oil on you, and you're actually able to get a large like container underneath. Like the drum was probably like 3 feet wide.
Right. Yeah, you
But
had one of those that you can wheel around,
yeah,
right?
yep.
Yeah.
So significantly easier. And then I was just thinking, I was like, do I have room in my garage for a two-post lift, even a short one? But no.
Trust me, I have thought about it. Back when I was doing a lot more work on my cars, I definitely looked into it, and I was like, "Okay, I can't spend
Yeah.
that kind of money." So, let's talk about something that we actually know a little bit of something about. So 2 weeks ago, for those of you that follow the, episode, or for those of you that follow the show, 2 weeks ago, we did DR testing part 1, and then, we aired a great speaking of DR testing, a great episode from 2021, which was the best DR testing story ever, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah. The scariest, I would say.
Yeah, where a guy for reasons that he goes into in the show, he essentially purposefully destroys his production environment, not just for DR testing, but as a matter of how everything happened. He ends up testing his DR system, and it does work, but oh my god, there was a quote in there that said something like he had a long weekend that lasted like 5 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
So
one of
yeah,
the things, it's like, and the other challenge is he was up in Alaska,
yeah,
right? If he needed to get parts or other things like that,
right,
good luck. It's like
yeah,
when
exactly,
if I'm about to do like a house repair or something else like that, it's like, not to do it on a Saturday or a Sunday or a Friday.
right,
Because if you have to call someone or you need to pick up something and you don't do it at night.
yeah, definitely don't do it at night, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great episode. If you didn't listen to that episode, that is a great episode. And yeah, listen to that. So this one, the 2 weeks ago, we talked essentially about getting ready to do the DR test, preparing for it, setting the scope for it, agreeing on what's going to be a success. And then this week, we're going to talk about actually executing the DR test. And again, this is a DR test. What would you say is the purpose of a DR test, Persona?
To make sure that you're actually, in the case of an actual disaster, you're able to recover as agreed upon, whatever your agreement was.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the general. Yeah, obviously that's the purpose of a test in general, right? Is to test whether or not you can do it when you need it. But since most tests fail, I'm going to say that the other purpose, and perhaps the bigger purpose, is to fix the parts of your of
Yeah.
the TR system that you discover are broken in some way,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Like,
and
yeah.
so probably one of the biggest outcomes of a DR test is to feed back into the DR plan,
Yeah.
right?
And
Yeah,
just in terms of what fails, I know sometimes people are like, oh, it's just thinking about like, I can't restore the data. But a lot of times, what really fails is the dependencies that you didn't consider, right?
right.
Did you make sure you're able to fail over and recover your Active Directory in your DR site before you can bring your applications online?
You I'm glad you brought that up because I aired another
Yep.
classic episode about the actual disaster recovery on an island, and, again, what's with the islands, right?
Yeah.
Because Alaska was Kodiak Island, but this was a Caribbean island, and they do an actual recovery because there was a hurricane that took it out. And one of those dependencies that you talked about was the lack of internet
Yeah.
and the lack of power, the lack of internet. These are all things that we come to expect on a normal everyday basis, which
In a
an actual
disaster.
disaster is not or
Yep.
is not that, right?
Yeah. And we also had that other episode. Do you remember? Maybe, I don't know if you want to air that or not. The derecho one.
That's right, the one that talked about the derecho. I'm gonna have to go find that one because it's not titled the derecho
Yeah.
episode. It was, um, I'll have to find if I can find that, I'll rebroadcast it in the keeping of
Yeah.
the disaster recovery theme. I'll definitely see if I can find that one and because that was also very good. I didn't even know what a derecho was. A derecho is a land hurricane, a hurricane that forms over land. I don't know why it's called a derecho, but that is what it is, right?
Yep.
To me, that just means right, to the right in Spanish. It is what it is. So we talk about if we're executing the DR test, we've agreed on what we're going to test. We've agreed on what the success criteria is. It's time to actually start walking through the test. We're going to have, and also we created an environment that we're going to test in. We're not doing what our friend from Alaska
Yeah,
did.
I was just thinking, are you just gonna go around like the TV shows when they get hit with an attack and they're just like, plug the cables up, plug the cables.
Yeah. Don't do that. we have some sort of tested environment. Generally speaking, today's it's generally going to be the cloud, and we're going to start executing this test. Can you think of and one of the things, again, this is more of set of a thing, but one of the things you want to make sure is to allocate enough time for this, for this process to unfold in its natural evolution.
Well, I would say time, and then also make sure you have the resources, right? And I don't mean compute resources, but people, because
Right.
you are
Make
going to
sure the
need,
people are available,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Like, don't do this
Um,
at like quarter end because people may be firefighting other things, or
yeah, yeah. The company that the bank, we did it on a weekend, but it was a dedicated, a dedicated weekend where we're going to do the DR test. And we did that because, again, you're making all these resources available for the DR test, which means they're not available to do their day job, and their day job would happen during the week. So we chose to do it on the weekend. And I'd say the bigger you're going, the bigger this isn't coming out in English. The bigger the test, the bigger the need to prepare and to have, to make sure you have those resources and to not do it when the normal
yeah,
production stuff is going.
which requires buy-in from the business, communication, right? All these other
Yeah,
aspects, right? Because
yeah.
people need to understand.
Make sure you communicate to all the powers that be that you are doing a DR test, especially if you're going to do any kind of failover.
Yeah. And the
Um,
value of it too, right? Because you want this to be done on an ongoing basis. And
right,
you want to convince them up front, hey, here's why it's valuable. Such that when you go back and after the results, right, you're like, hey, we now need to do another DR test maybe 6 months down the line. They've
right.
already bought it.
Another thing, as we're going through the DR test, we're documenting what went right, what went wrong, especially what went wrong, right?
So
Um, Go ahead.
so this is an interesting thing because when we had Mike on the podcast, right, and he was talking about sort of doing these tabletop exercises, right? I think it's important the person documenting kind of needs to take an objective perspective
Mhm.
to this, right? Because you may be showing some biases, or the person documenting may not want to document certain things, or may just sort of dismiss it as, hey, this isn't important,
Right,
right?
right,
Versus actually capturing what happened throughout the process.
right. Agreed. Um, the next thing is, and we covered this in the previous episode, but once we talked about testing little parts of the infrastructure, but once we've tested this piece and this piece and this piece, I do think it's important to test, you look at the scenario, what would this scenario do to our company, right? The scenario is a disaster. The scenario is a fire, a terrorist action, and it's going to take out all of this infrastructure. What would that do to us? So, for example, you might not need to test your ability to recover from a SaaS outage if you have a data center and your data center goes out,
Hmm.
right? It's going to be scenario dependent
Yeah.
what you're going to test, but um, you might what would be the impact to our business and our ability to use the different parts of our infrastructure. And so, speaking of dependencies, if we don't have internet of any kind, it is kind of a SaaS outage,
Yeah.
right? Right. Um, so we want to test as many of those parts of our infrastructure that are going to be impacted by the scenario that we're testing, right?
Yeah. And sometimes it's a little bit about unintended consequences or identifying gaps. It's like when you're writing code, right? You normally do unit tests. But then when you actually test the end to end functionality, you're like, oh, I didn't realize that this interacts with this other thing this way, and things don't work. That's why we also do end to end testing in addition to unit tests.
Yeah, and again, this is why back in the beginning I was saying that the purpose of the DR test is to identify these gaps,
Yeah.
right? The Yeah, I mean, we can have we can have that perfect test that goes well, and that's great, and everybody feels better, but it's just as valuable to find the DR test that had a big hole or a small hole, and, the and to document that and address that. And this is why we do it on a regular basis.
I have a question for you, Curtis.
Yeah.
Do you think DR testing? So most organizations have a risk management team,
Mhm.
right? Which usually has a lot of this information in terms of, okay, what are the business risks and everything else like that. But they're also probably the ones who are coordinating across the business in order to say, okay, let's do a test,
Mhm.
right? Where the infrastructure DR testing that we're talking about here is probably one portion of that overall strategy.
Mhm. Mhm.
Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, this is we're going to I think that if we're doing a real DR test, we're going to this is a business test as much as it is a technology test,
Yeah.
right? There is that overlap between business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. And maybe for a DR test, we're not concerned so much with like if it's just a DR test,
Yeah.
we're not concerned with, let's say, buildings and people, places for people to work and things like that. We're concerned more with getting the technology back up and running. But I'm glad you brought that up. That is a separate aspect that does need to be taken into
Yeah.
account.
Well, and the benefit with this is if there's already a team that is looking at that business continuity aspect,
Mhm.
right? You may not need to convince the business as much, right? In
Right.
order to be able to do
Right.
this, right? You should partner with people who already like that is their job, right? You're
Agreed.
helping
Agreed.
support them.
Agreed. We talked about documenting things that we discover here. I think that we should be maintaining like a log of, all of the tests and the things that we've learned from them, because again, that may be helpful for, for future generations of tests. It's important to have a DR run book and to have this, one of the purposes of the test is to update that run book. So let's just talk about that. Um, the 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 thing about having a DR run book, I do believe in having an electronic copy of the DR run book, but I also have the ability to easily update a paper copy of that run book. So the way to do that is to have some sort of documentation system online that you can easily update. Um, and then if you want to have a paper copy and you want to have a paper copy, then um, the best way to have that is a loose leaf type notebook system,
Yeah.
right? Where you can update pages of it, where you don't have to update the entire book.
I have a comment about the electronic copy.
Sure.
I would recommend also keeping a copy out of your normal corporate infrastructure.
Agreed. Right.
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 In case, say, you get hit with ransomware and you no longer have access to that infrastructure, or someone deletes your account that hosted that data, right? So make sure it's something completely disconnected as well, a copy just in case. And I go back to think about the Pixar story,
Right.
right?
Right.
Where they just happen to be lucky with Toy Story 2 and have a copy offsite, offline to save the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think obviously we have to keep security in mind. We have to make sure that wherever that system, wherever that other copy is, it's protected by security. But the whole point of it is to have it outside the normal security.
Yeah.
So there's a balance that you need to have there, right? What about communications during the DR test? We need to keep everyone abreast of what's going on. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So you want to make sure people aren't working in silos, and because during a DR test, things are going to be chaotic, right? But since this is more of a controlled environment, you want to establish those patterns
Hmm.
and say, this is a normal way that we communicate. It might be via phones, it might be emails, you might jump into a video conference, right? Whatever it is that you use, make sure that you have all the right stakeholders in that session, right?
Right.
In order so that everyone knows what's going on. The other thing though, to mention is make sure you also have alternate methods, right? Just like what we talked about the run book itself, make sure
Right.
in case your voice over IP phones are down, in your corporate environment, or your chat Slack is down, or whatever else you're using,
Right.
right? Make sure you have an alternate mechanism to get in touch with people.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I mean, it is
Smoke
essential to
signals.
have communication during it. What'd you say?
Smoke signals.
So signals. It's a real challenge because we depend so much on technology. And I would say that um again, if it's an outage, generally the outage is for you and not for everything else. So, for example, if you're relying on Zoom as your mechanism, Zoom will probably be up when you have your outage. You just have to need to make sure that everybody can get to Zoom. So, if, for example, your challenge there will be if you're using, you know, a third party authentication mechanism to get into Zoom, and then you don't have access to that, that could
Yeah.
be a problem. So these are the things you want to make sure. You want to be able to make sure that you can communicate during the outage. And I can definitely think of a multi-headed Zoom call where everybody's just sort of keeping everybody abreast of what's going on,
Yep.
right? We want to make sure that the stakeholders are aware of everything that's going on, as well as the people that are executing executing the test. And then what about, I think, by the way, the Zoom call, I think, is the best way to have, or something like a Zoom call, to have coordination between the teams.
Yep.
There are multiple teams that are happening. You don't necessarily have to have everybody who's doing something with the DR uh, to be on the Zoom call, but the purpose of the Zoom call, I think, is probably to keep all of the different teams aware of what the other teams are doing, right?
It's almost like a war room, if you will, right?
Yeah, exactly. The bigger the test, the bigger it is, the
Mm.
bigger the need is to have some type of communication like
Yeah.
this, right? Then you've also got escalation procedures. What happens if something doesn't go right? Who do we call?
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Or you could throw a monkey wrench in things and be like, someone's about to do normally as part of the DR test, right? Or would be responsible for something. You could be like, that person is homesick with the flu and cannot be in the office. Now what do you do?
yeah, yeah. If your DR test says, call Steve, this is the, the more you have something like that, the bigger
Yeah.
that kind of thing is going to be a problem,
It's
right?
funny you bring this up. So I was reading the Register this morning,
Hmm.
and there was a call in or a write in from a reader.
Hmm.
And they were saying that they had worked at a company in IT and managed a bunch of infrastructure, and they had built this system to automate all of their software deployment stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and then they had quit the company, but no one knew how to operate it. And he had left his number. It's in the closet, was a machine. He had left his number. It said, "Do not reboot, call Steve," or whatever his name was. He got the call, and this was like 20 years later.
Wow.
He got a call and he was like, "I don't remember the password. I'm sorry. You got to figure it out on your own."
Wow. That's crazy. That's just crazy. Oh, Steve, that's funny. Yeah, don't be like that. Um, so, uh, let's just say we get to the end of the test, right? We've successfully recovered all of the aspects. If we're doing a full DR test, what needs to happen is a full sort of end-to-end functional test of the different parts of the business to make sure that not just that a system was recovered or a database was recovered, but the application and the system around that application is able to function. And again, this is why we go into things like phone systems, right?
Yeah.
If the application that we're recovering is our customer call center, but we don't have phones. Great.
Oops.
You know, all of that stuff has to work, and you've got to do the functional end-to-end test to make sure that all of the parts that you are pretending were damaged are now fully functional.
I agree to that, but I think it's also one of the things you have to be careful not to boil the ocean. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again,
It's a
this is about
balance. Yeah.
what's that?
It's a balance.
Well, what I'm saying is, whatever it is, I think what you're talking about is more about scope,
Yes.
right? because even if we just agreed to test this one part of the application, you need to do a functional test of whatever it is that you recovered, even if it's just a small part of the environment. What I'm s- that that's all I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? That 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 we often focus a little bit too much time on the recovery, the restore, and we say, okay,
Yeah.
the application's restored, I can walk away. No, the application's restored when the
Everything else.
application is
Yeah.
restored, when people can do the thing that
Yeah.
whatever it is that
Yeah.
application was
Yeah.
supposed
I was thinking more about be careful about thinking about all the failure scenarios. Like I was saying, the person gets sick with the flu, right?
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah,
be
yeah, yeah.
careful about going down that rabbit hole because you will never come back out. Because it might be, what if the butterfly flaps its wing halfway around the world and causes XYZ, right? So,
The butterfly walt.
right. So don't get overwhelmed by these scenarios.
Yeah, and speaking of not being overwhelmed, when we get to when we get to the post-game analysis, right? Let's measure against the success criteria that we agreed to. We look at the things that didn't work, bottlenecks and things like that. The key again here is to better the world, not to prove that you were the best or whatever. I
Or
know it can
Curtis
be
was the
really
worst,
difficult. Say that again?
or you were the worst.
Or yeah. We're looking for things that we can improve. We're looking for procedures that we can update based on, the lessons that we learn. Any other post-game analysis that you can think of?
I would also say if this is your first time doing this, I think it's also good to say what things went well. I think a lot of times we tend to focus on the negatives,
Right.
right? But if this is your first time, like this is really hard. This is a hard thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And you should acknowledge that and realize if you got through, like, I know, Curtis, you've always talked about the bank in your DR test, right? And how, like, I don't think you guys ever completed 100% of it,
No.
right?
No.
So, no,
Yeah. Yeah. So don't be too hard on yourself. Congratulate yourself, first off, on doing the test in the first place. And second, making it to the end of the test, even if everyone is dead. um, yeah, don't be too hard on yourself, right? Because these things rarely do they go well,
yeah,
unless it's like fully automated. And the more I will say, the more you can automate things, the better, right?
yeah. So you ran the tests, you've
Mhm.
identified things that went well, things that went wrong. I think the next step after that is identifying how do you close the gaps, right?
Right,
And coming up with the plan because you don't want to just let these things linger, right?
right.
So create a plan, identify what are the most critical elements that you want to address first and
Hmm.
timeframes, and make sure you get buy-in across the board to fix those things.
Yeah, agreed. Right. You have an action item list and who's responsible for addressing the different things. And then, of course, what's the next thing? You do it again, right?
When?
Soon, right? I would say I'm a fan of more frequent, smaller tests than like an annual huge
Yeah.
test, right? I think the more often we do that, the more we get into the mindset of thinking about the things that can go wrong, because a lot of things are um, they're the same on different disciplines across the organization, right?
Yeah.
So the more often we test, the more often we get to a recovery mindset, and we start including those things in the system design from the very beginning,
Yeah.
right? Again, that's the other purpose. I would add that to my original question. That's the other purpose of a DR test, is to get people to a DR mindset,
Yeah.
to a recovery mindset of saying, we need to design the infrastructure and the processes around the infrastructure so that they are easy to recovery.
Yep. Or at least even think about it to start with rather than, oh yeah, this failed. Now what were we going to do with our DR?
Yeah, and let me just give you a silly but simple example of what happens when you don't have a recovery mindset? So I go back to the bank, right? I have so many good stories from the days of the bank, right? And when we bought a T1000, which was an HP server, it was a really big server, and it was a huge server. It had 100 gigabytes of data.
Ginormous. Wait, let me look at my
Ginormous.
flash drive.
It was a huge server for the time, and it came with a 2 gigabyte tape drive, right? I think with compression, it was like a 4 gigabyte tape drive. That was a system design, and there were no changes. No, we added 30% with one server. We added 30% to the capacity of the data center with one server. There wasn't a single discussion about what we should do from a backup and recovery perspective. That's what happens when you don't have a recovery mindset.
Yeah.
Right? Is that you do things, you add things to the system without any thought to what they would, you know, how that would impact the recovery system.
Yeah.
So that's why we want to have a recovery mindset. Okie dokie.
I think we covered everything. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Everything you could possibly want to know about DR in 4 episodes with the two, maybe 5. We'll see. We'll see if I can find that other episode. Thanks, Prasanna, for once again, great team.
Woohoo! Go team, go.
Go team, go. And I want to thank you once again to our listeners. We'd be nothing without you. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links from my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.